Okay, let's unpack this. Plato, way back when, declared, "There is no art of poetry." And then he followed it up with this really quite spicy claim that poets are possessed by a divine inspiration. Only mad people.
Wow.
Think about that basically saying poetry isn't a skill, it's like a form of temporary insanity.
Right. It's quite the opening shot.
Yeah.
And that bold statement, it really ignited a debate that's just echoed through centuries, hasn't it? A fundamental argument about what poetry actually is and, well, why it even matters.
Exactly. It's like he threw down this gauntlet, and critics for hundreds of years have been picking it up, looking at it, arguing with it.
And building their own ideas in response. Yeah. It's this fascinating, long-running conversation across literary history.
And that's the deep dive we're taking today. We're going to trace how different literary periods, classical, neoclassical, romantic, modern, how they all sort of grappled with Plato's challenge.
How they developed their own distinct takes on poetry.
Yeah. Consider this your express ticket through centuries of poetic thought. We'll hit the key landmarks, and hopefully you'll get those brilliant aha moments as we see how these perspectives connect and sometimes clash and evolve.
It really does make you wonder, doesn't it? How thinkers from such different times, different worldviews approach these core questions. The fact Plato's initial, let's say, provocation kept sparking such varied answers speaks volumes.
It really does. And our exploration today, it draws from a really rich collection of critical writings, each offering a unique angle on this art form.
So where do we start? Back to Plato's original problem.
Let's do it. Back to the classical period. Now, a key concept for him was mimesis. Can you break that down simply for us?
Sure. So imagine like the perfect idea of a chair that's Plato's idea or form.
Yeah.
It's the true reality.
The blueprint.
Exactly, the blueprint, the physical chair we actually sit on. That's just an imitation, a copy of that perfect blueprint. So for Plato, reality was in that realm of ideal forms, the physical world we see. That's already one step removed.
Right. Okay, so if our world is already a copy, where do poets fit in?
Well, Plato saw poets as imitating the things in the physical world. You know, a painting of a chair, a poem about a tree.
Oh, okay.
So that made their work a copy of a copy. Or as he put it, twice removed from reality and truth.
Ouch. Like a photocopy of a photocopy.
Pretty much, yeah. The clarity gets diminished each time.
And his worries weren't just philosophical, were they? He had real concerns about education, society.
Absolutely. In his ideal republic, he was deeply concerned with shaping virtuous citizens, especially the young, and he felt that poetry often showed, well, unacceptable instances of behavior.
Bad examples.
Bad examples, flawed characters presented as role models. He worried it could negatively influence young minds. He much preferred hymns to the gods, patriotic stuff about the state, stories with clear moral lessons.
So poetry that served a very specific educational purpose. No epics just for the thrill of it.
Not in his ideal setup, no. And then there's that whole divine madness thing from his dialogue, Ion. How did that fit in?
Right. That's such a fascinating argument. He uses this analogy of a magnet. God is like the main magnet, inspiring the muses.
Okay.
The muses then inspire poets, like Homer. Homer inspires a performer, like Ion. And Ion then moves the audience. It's like a chain.
Chain of inspiration. But what was Plato's point with the magnet?
His point was that Ion's skill in reciting Homer wasn't based on actual knowledge or understanding of the poem's content. It was this irrational, divine force flowing through him.
Like magnetic energy through iron rings.
Exactly. So Ion wasn't a skilled artist in control. He was more like a vessel, a mouthpiece for this, well, divine possession, almost manic inspiration.
So closer to madness than mastery, because it wasn't rooted in reason or real understanding.
Precisely. It really diminishes the role of skill and intention and intellect in making poetry.
But he didn't totally slam the door shut, did he? He left a little opening.
That's right. He kind of issued a challenge. He said if poets could defend their art, persuasively in verse or prose, maybe they could come back into the Republic.
And that little opening is so crucial. It directly sets the stage for his student, Aristotle.
Enter Aristotle, yeah, with his poetics, and basically saying, hold on a minute, there is an art of poetry.
A direct counter. And he tackled Plato's criticisms head on, starting with a very different take on mimesis.
Right. Plato saw it as just bad copying, but Aristotle
saw it as a natural human instinct. It's how we learn, how we make sense of the world. Think about kids learning through imitation. It's fundamental.
Okay, so not mindless replication.
Not at all. He focused particularly on tragedy, defining it not as imitating people, but as an imitation of action and life, of happiness and misery. He saw poetry representing events and human experiences as offering a unique kind of understanding, different from philosophy's abstract ideas.
And this is where catharsis comes in, that famous emotional release.
Yes, exactly. Aristotle argued that tragedy, by imitating suffering and intense emotion, allows the audience to experience a kind of purification, a purging, of feelings like pity and fear.
So it's like an emotional workout in a safe space.
You could put it that way. A way to engage with powerful feelings without the real-world danger or consequences.
Right.
Like a pressure valve.
So rather than corrupting people like Plato feared,
It could actually have a therapeutic effect. Aristotle believed witnessing these imitations, even of disturbing things, could be a valuable learning and experience device. It allows for reflection, emotional release, without the actual trauma.
okay, so Aristotle defends poetry philosophically, even psychologically. Now let's bring in Longinus. He talked about the sublime, which sounds intense.
It is. Longinus really shifted the focus. It wasn't just about imitation or function, but about the impact on the reader or listener. For him, sublime poetry or sublimity was about language that just grabs you.
Grabs you how?
Language that, when you read or hear it, carried away or transported to another place, a higher mode of being. It's that feeling of awe, being totally swept up and moved by the power of the words.
So it's about the feeling it evokes more than just the content.
Exactly. And he was very clear about what it isn't. It's not just loud, bombastic language or trying too hard to sound grand or using cliches.
Okay.
True sublimity, he argued, is the echo of a great soul. It's tied to the genius, the depth of the poet's thought and feeling.
And how does that great soul actually show up in the poem?
Well, Longinus pointed to 5 sources. 2 were linked to genius, great thoughts and powerful, noble passions. The other 3 were more about art or craft, skillful use of figures of speech, noble diction, and dignified word arrangement.
But the thought and passion were primary.
Absolutely. Those were the most fundamental. Though he did also add an interesting, maybe slightly elitist layer. He felt only refined, cultivated audiences could truly judge or appreciate sublimity.
Okay. But here's the really fun part, right? He uses Plato himself as an example.
Yes. Isn't that brilliant? The same Plato who wanted to banish poets.
How does that work?
Longinus argues that Plato, even while criticizing poetry theoretically, often achieved the sublime in his own writing. Think about his myths, his allegories, his incredibly vivid imagery. Longinus says that it achieves the sublime effect.
So he kind of turns Plato on his head.
Completely. Suggesting that even Plato couldn't escape the power of poetic language to move and elevate the spirit.
That's fantastic. So Longinus is almost saying sublime poetry does what Plato thought only philosophy could make us better people. Maybe hinting we need poet kings.
That's a really interesting reading.
Yeah.
He definitely elevates the transformative power of great poetry. Which brings us then to Horace, who takes yet another angle. He's more focused on the practical function of poetry.
Okay, so Horace isn't so worried about imitation or overwhelming power, but more about what poetry does for the audience.
Precisely. Horace famously said the function of poetry is both to delight and to instruct. Simple as that, almost.
Entertain and teach.
Yeah. Or, ideally, do both at the same time.
Yeah.
Create something beautiful that also offers some wisdom or insight. He said, it is not enough for poems to have beauty. They must also be pleasing and lead listeners' soul whither they will.
Like an enjoyable lesson?
In a way, yes. And he also really emphasized decorum.
Decorum, meaning?
Using language appropriate to the subject, the genre, the characters. You know, elevated language for epic heroes, everyday speech for comedy. Suitability. He also paid close attention to craft character, plot, diction, the ideas offering practical advice for writing well.
And he had that comparison of poetry to painting.
He did. He said some poems, like some paintings, are best appreciated up close. You see the fine details. Others need distance for the full effect. He used it to show the different ways poetry works on us, the varied effects it has, rather than just being about, a visual copy of reality.
Right. Okay, so we've gone from Plato's dismissal to Aristotle's defense via catharsis, Longinus's sublime power, Horace's delightful instruction. That really sets the stage for the neoclassical period. Figures like Samuel Johnson, what was his take?
Well, Johnson, often speaking through the character Imlac in his work Rasselas, saw poetry as the highest literary form. He believed it could communicate profound truths about being human, even truths people might find hard to believe otherwise.
The highest form, that's strong. What kind of truths?
Imlac suggests poetry should embrace everything, the high and the low of human experience. He even says the poet needs to know everything.
Know everything. Wow.
Yeah, Risalis is pretty astonished too.
Right.
But Johnson's real point, I think, was a warning against getting lost in tiny details, what he called the streaks of the tulip.
Okay, so don't sweat the small stuff. Focus on what?
Focus on general truths, the universal human condition. Johnson believed art should resonate with the big experiences we all share across time. The poet's job was to examine the species, remarking the general properties and large appearances.
Capture universality. Things like love, loss, ambition.
Exactly. Those fundamental things that make us human, moving beyond just a specific instance to grasp the bigger picture.
Right, which then makes the Romantic era feel like such a dramatic shift, doesn't it? They seem to challenge so much of this, especially the focus on feeling and the individual poet.
Yeah, absolutely. The Romantics really flipped the script. The focus moved from the poem and reader relationship to the poet and poem connection. Figures like Wordsworth and Coleridge, especially with lyrical ballads, champion nature, imagination, personal experience.
And Wordsworth's definition of a poet is one everyone knows, right? A man speaking to men, endowed with more lively sensibility.
More enthusiasm and tenderness. Yes, it perfectly captures that romantic ideal of the poet as this deeply feeling, sensitive soul. In his definition of poetry itself, the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, it takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility.
That's key too, recollected in tranquility. So it's not just raw, immediate feeling.
No, that's crucial. There's the initial powerful emotion, but then there's reflection. The act of thinking about it later, calmly, is what shapes it into art. It's feeling plus reflection.
And he stressed that the feeling gives importance to the situation, not the other way around.
Exactly. The emotional core drives the poem. And he famously looked for that core in simple rusting setting and common characters. He thought the essential passions of the heart were found most clearly there in ordinary lives close to nature.
Like in his poem, Michael, contrasting rural endurance with city life.
Precisely. Finding profound emotion in the everyday. And he also used that technique, defamiliarization.
Making the familiar seem strange and new again.
Yes, taking something ordinary like a daffodil and presenting it in a way that makes you see it with fresh eyes, with wonder, or how Lucy Gray becomes this almost mystical spirit in the landscape.
That's such a hallmark of Romanticism, isn't it? Seeing the wonder in the ordinary. It's so different from the classical idea of poetry just reflecting reality.
Totally different. For Romantics, imitation wasn't reflection, it was transformation. The poet sees the world, filters it through their imagination and emotion, and gives it a new form.
And Coleridge, Wordsworth's collaborator, he also put huge emphasis on imagination.
Immense emphasis. He even distinguished between the primary imagination, just our basic perception, and the secondary imagination, which is the poet's active, creative power.
Yeah.
He saw it as almost godlike, going beyond even philosophy.
Wow. And his approach differed slightly from Wordsworth's.
Yeah, it's often said that while Wordsworth made the familiar strange, Coleridge aimed to make the unfamiliar familiar. Think of the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, all that strangeness, the supernatural stuff, becomes relatable through the mariner's inner journey, his emotional discovery.
Ah, that's a neat distinction. Wordsworth finds wonder in the everyday. Coleridge finds the human in the extraordinary. And then there's John Stuart Mill, also focused on emotion.
Very much so. Mill stated it quite plainly. The object of poetry is confessedly to act upon the emotions. He saw a clear line. Science and fact address belief, try to convince you. Poetry speaks to your sensibilities, your feelings.
By offering interesting objects of contemplation.
Exactly. It moves you by giving your feelings something to engage with. He also had that interesting idea about age and appreciation.
That we appreciate poetry more as adults.
Yeah, he thought kids with less developed emotional lives prefer stories focused on external action. Poetry, delving into the deeper and more secret workings of human emotion, hits home more when you've, well, lived a bit more, experienced more complex feelings.
And he saw poets as often quite introspective, maybe not worldly wise, but experts on their own inner lives.
Yes, almost ignorant of life, practically, but incredibly observant of their own emotions. He even described poetry as a kind of soliloquy.
Talking to oneself, almost, in his definition. Man's thoughts tinged by his feelings. That really sums up that romantic idea.
It does. Emotion coloring thought. He set that apart from eloquence, where the goal is impressing others. Poetry, for Mill, had to be authentic feeling.
Okay, so moving into the modern period, Critics like Matthew Arnold seem to shift focus again, this time onto criticism itself.
Yes, Arnold saw criticism as having this crucial role in sort of preparing the ground for great poetry. His famous aim for criticism was seeing the object as in itself it really is.
Trying to be objective, stripping away agendas.
Exactly, setting aside personal biases, politics, trends to understand the work on its own terms. He believed this clear-sighted criticism created an intellectual situation, a climate where creative power could really flourish. Great art needed the right environment.
So criticism wasn't just about judging, but about cultivating the conditions for great art.
Precisely. He talked about the need for disinterestedness in criticism, keeping aloof from what is called the practical view of things to achieve objective judgment. This open, impartial engagement with ideas was vital for literary progress, in his view.
Which then leads us to T.S. Eliot, another huge figure in modern criticism, with his ideas about objective criticism, but also perdition.
Yes, Eliot also pushed for objective criticism, judging the work itself, not the author's life or motives. But for him, the absolute key was tradition.
He wasn't a big fan of the romantic focus on the poet's personality being the main thing, was he?
No, he really critiqued that. Eliot argued that a great poem doesn't just spring from the individual. It exists in a dynamic relationship with all the poetry that came before it.
That's his idea of the historical sense.
Exactly. A poet needs this historical sense and awareness, not just that the past happened, but that the past is still present, alive in literature now. Understanding that whole literary heritage was essential for creating anything truly new and significant.
So the poet has to be in conversation with literary history.
Constantly. Eliot saw the timeless, the tradition, the canon, and the temporal, the new work, the novelty needing to merge in the poet's mind. And this took real effort, real learning.
And he used that analogy of the poet as a catalyst.
Yes, like in a chemical reaction. The poet's mind is the medium, the catalyst, that brings together elements from the past and present knowledge experience to create something new. But the catalyst itself, the poet's personality, ideally remains neutral, unchanged by the process.
Wow. Okay, so from Plato basically trying to kick poets out.
Right.
We've traced this incredible journey, concerns about truth, morality, the power of emotion, imagination, poetry's function, the role of criticism, the weight of tradition. It's quite a ride.
It really is a rich, ongoing conversation. Each era reacting, building, reinterpreting, giving us this complex, layered understanding of poetry, those aha moments you mentioned.
Yeah.
They really come from seeing these connections and contrasts.
Absolutely. It definitely gives you a much deeper appreciation for how we think about and read poetry today. So as we wrap up this deep dive, here's maybe a final thought for you listening at home. Given all these diverse perspectives, Plato's challenge, Aristotle's defense, the Romantics' feelings, Eliot's tradition, what do you think? What's the essence or the value of poetry for us right now? Is there one definition that really clicks for you?
Yeah.
Or is the beauty actually in having all these different ways to look at it?